Hello and welcome to Carnivorist Chats. My name is James, your host. I started this podcast to help other folks share their own healing stories and to interview thought leaders and experts in the carnivore, keto, and low oxalate space. Before we begin, I'd like to give a shout out to Equip Foods and the Carnivore Bar. As an affiliate, you can use the link in the show notes to get a discount on their products when you check out using the code Carnivorist. Thanks in advance for listening, subscribing, and any likes or shares. And now, on with the podcast. Hi, everyone. It's James, your host. Today is a particularly gratifying day for me and an exciting one because my guest today, not only is she an author, but she's a science journalist and has even recently got her PhD. Congratulations and welcome to Carnivorist Chats, Nina Teicholz.
Thank you, James. It's great to be here.
Nina, what an honor it is for me to chat to you. And we were chatting a little bit offline about my health journey, and my listeners know that I was a vegan and pescatarian/vegetarian for many, many years, even prior to becoming vegan, and my health went off a cliff. And I wish I had found your wonderful book, which is celebrating 10 years. I can't believe it. 10 years on May 13th, The Big Fat Surprise. And I found it, of course, after I had decided to add animal foods back in my diet to sort of reinforce the decision I was making. But it was so instrumental in that regard. And I know people are still finding it and still finding it just amazing, the story, the page turner that it is. So thank you for that.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah, I mean, I hope I can do maybe another edition of that at some point because I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if there's any other place where all that research is all together. I mean, it took me 9 years of research really to put it all together. And then it takes a lot of time to write something in a way that people find it engaging. It's not necessarily true that nutrition is like a thrilling story. Yeah, I feel lucky to have been able to do that.
We are the lucky ones, Nina, because your dedication and the way you approached it and just breaking it down from beginning to ongoing where we are today, and we'll get into the story, it was just not only an easy read from a science-backed perspective, but it was, as you said, it's a nutritional thriller, because when you start to peel back the layers on all this stuff that happened, everyone is just like, oh my God, how did this happen? And that's where I want to begin today. I always say, and people laugh, I say, the best place to start is the beginning. And Nina, I know for you, and please forgive me, but I'm going to probably say we'll need more than one chat together to cover all this fun stuff that I'd love to talk to you about. And I'm very conscious of your time today. And thanks again for joining me. But what caused you to, and I know it was because you were doing some restaurant reviews and looking at trans fats and then start to really dig into that. But what caused you to say, there's something going on here? There's a story that I need to tell about this vilification of saturated fat and other things. I wonder if you can let the listeners know, and apologies, I know you've answered this many times.
There was this restaurant review column that I was doing that was sort of a throwaway in New York City, and I couldn't afford, we didn't have the budget to pay for meals, and so I would have to accept whatever the chef would send out to me as his or her idea of the best possible foods they had to offer. And so they would send me red meats, pate, foie gras. Those are considered very sophisticated foods. Like, I wasn't eating those foods because I had not eaten red meat for more than 25 years. I had shunned butter, and I always was choosing vegetarian options on menus. I don't even know why I thought I could be a food reviewer, but I had to eat these foods when they were served to me, and I found them so delicious and textured. And I also found myself effortlessly losing weight. I went to the doctor. I said, please check my cholesterol. I'm going to die of a heart attack. And my cholesterol levels had improved. So, that just created this big question in my mind, like, why, how could that be possibly true? But probably the more immediate impetus for this book was the fact that as a reporter and doing stories for Gourmet magazine, investigative stories into the food industry, I basically broke the trans fat story in like 2003, 2004. It was the most emailed story in that magazine's recent history. I was given offers to write a book on trans fats. What were trans fats? Like, I didn't even really know. But I had, for that story, started researching scientists who were telling me things like, oh, we were hired to harass researchers on stage at conferences for presenting information that was negative about vegetable oils. We were hired by the vegetable oil industry. As an editor, I was visited by people from the margarine industry to ask me to yank this inconvenient article on vegetable oils from my academic journal. I mean, those kinds of stories really alarmed me. It seemed so different from what I had thought the way that science ought to function, still do. And so I spent actually the first 2 years in writing my book interviewing what is we call seed oil chemists, really is their term. They're people who know the science of vegetable oils. I learned everything about vegetable oils. And that's actually my book is the first place that you'll read about, seed oils. First of all, coining the term seed oils and saying, like, here's the history, here's how they came into the food supply. They used to be machine lubricants in the Industrial Revolution. Here's how they came into the food supply. Here's the fact that they are easily oxidized and drive inflammation, probably causing heart disease, almost certainly cancers. So that was the beginning of my book. I didn't really know, I wasn't thinking about saturated fats, but of course, vegetable oils replace saturated fats. And then I got into the story of Ancel Keys, the whole saturated fat story, low fat story, and then I did a whole chapter on the Mediterranean diet. Anyway, at that point, I thought it was going to be a book like, hey, let's take a tour through dietary fats. And my editor, bless her, she looked at my manuscript, I don't know, 6 years in, and she said, this is a book that is about saturated fats, how we got it wrong on saturated fats. And she said, that is your focus. So that's sort of how it happened. I didn't set out to write, obviously, this book, but that's how it evolved. So it's a book about, the main focus is saturated fats, unfairly villainized. We got it wrong on saturated fats. The seed oils that came in to replace them are very likely causing far more harm than good, and are inflammatory. And then a chapter on the Mediterranean diet, which reveals a lot about the politics of the food world, with the Mediterranean diet promoted by Harvard. And I mean, it's just really draws back the curtain on the politics and the money in the world of nutrition.
That's amazing. I've listened to a number of your podcasts, and I'm still astounded about how this journey took shape for you, and then also the things that you uncovered, of course, and continue to uncover. And we'll get when I finish up today, I wanted to just ask you your thoughts about the state of where we are now. And there's a few examples we've seen recently. I know you've been posting about the American Diabetic Association and the Harvard study that meat causes diabetes. We'll touch on that. Going back to this character. And Nina, I was born 1972, and I can recall when this vilification of saturated fats came into play, because even at a young age, I would go to my grandmother's house and we would have all the stuff, the fatty red meat, just at my grandmother's house, and then the butter. But then when we came home, my mom, who is still vegetarian to this day, we started seeing things like, I can't believe it's not butter, and margarine appearing, and the changes. And then even as you talked about, and we'll talk about in a little bit, the Mediterranean diet, and all of a sudden olive oil was appearing on our kitchen table. Let's talk about where it all started, and this character, Ancel Keys, a little bit. I hate even talking about him, but he's such an integral part of this. And it all had to do with the sort of in the 1960s. And then, of course, Eisenhower having his heart attack, if memory serves me. And then it all sort of hit the fan, if we will. But I wonder if you could paint the picture and give a little sort of a high level view of how we all got to where we are now, Nina, because of that.
So it's important to understand that we did not always believe that saturated fats and red meat are bad for health, that these ideas have a moment in time where they originated. And they really can be traced back to Ancel Keys, a physiologist at the University of Minnesota, who he was a researcher looking at dietary fats, and he had done some small animal experiments, but he got into his mind that it was first he thought it was total fat that caused heart disease, and then he decided no, it's saturated fat and dietary cholesterol that caused heart disease, his so-called diet heart hypothesis. He was able to become very aggressive and self-promoting man who just was extremely diligent in promoting his own ideas. Even his friends and colleagues called him overly aggressive, and he could fight anyone to the death. But he was also very persuasive. He became very close to Paul Dudley Moore, who was the doctor of President Eisenhower. And Eisenhower had his heart attack in 1955 out of the Oval Office for 10 days. That's a really long time. The entire focus of the nation is on this event. And really, people were terrified by heart disease, which had been rare to non-existent in the early 1900s and had quickly risen by the 1940s to become the #1 killer disease in America. People didn't know what caused it. There was a panic in the nation, and there were a number of competing ideas. There was the idea that it was caused by vitamin deficiency, the increasing amount of auto exhaust in the air, the type A personality where you run around screaming at people and then have a heart attack. And those were viable theories proposed by respected research scientists. But Ancel Keys, with his dominant personality, was able to insert his idea into the American Heart Association. This was in 1960. He joins the American Heart Association as part of their influential nutrition committee. And by the next year, 1961, he has convinced that little committee to publish a statement saying the best possible way to avoid heart disease was by cutting back on saturated fat and dietary cholesterol. That document is the first official policy anywhere in the world telling us to avoid saturated fat and cholesterol as the best measure of prevention against heart disease. It is from that tiny little acorn that the whole giant oak tree of advice, now up to the World Health Organization, is telling us to limit our intake of saturated fat. So that is really where it started. I talk in my book at length. I think I done more research on this than anybody else about the study that he cites as legitimizing this recommendation. So the famous 7-country study was not even published in 1961 when he came out with that statement, would not be published till 1970, but he's already accumulating all this data, more than any other scientist has out there. And he asserts it and says, I have more data than you do. And my 7-country study, which was on almost 13,000 men, only men, in the US, Japan, and a number of European countries, seemed to show an association between consumption of saturated fat and cholesterol and death from heart disease. It appeared to show that. It's very weak associational data. In my deep dive for probably 6 months on that study, I found a number of problems with it. The big one that has been noted also by other people is that he didn't randomly select his countries. He knew from pilot experiments he had done in various different European nations, he knew that if he chose the Italians and the Yugoslavians and the Greeks, that these people ate very little saturated fat and also had low rates of heart disease, and would prove his hypothesis. They were eating very little saturated fats because it was post-World War II and their food supplies were hugely disrupted, and it did not represent a fair sampling of their typical diet. However, and Ancel Keys also knew, that Switzerland, West Germany, France, home of the omelet eater and, butter eaters, sausage, that they would disprove his hypothesis, and he did not choose those countries. Despite an effort by his co-authors in the last 10 years to try to defend his choice of countries, there's no evidence that he chose those in a random way. So that's, I think, that's a principal critique. He took dietary samples from only 3.9% of the population, not a statistically representative sample. And there's just a laundry list of things that went wrong. A very famous one that I was kind of astonished to find was that one of the 3 trips that he went to the island of Crete were his star subjects who seemed to wander and till the fields all day long, eat very little animal foods, live long lives. He one of the periods when he visited that island, they were experiencing Lent, an extremely strict fasting period where no animal foods are taken under the Orthodox, the rules of the Orthodox Church. So, and above, even sort of above all that, is the overarching critique that this is an association, a not a cause and effect piece of evidence. It shows an association, not causation. There are other things in these people's lives that could also have been responsible for their low rates of heart disease. For instance, what was later found by Ancel Keys's colleagues and published in 1989 was that what most closely associated with low rates of heart disease was most closely associated with high rates of heart disease was the intake of sweets. So desserts, sugary things, and now I think we know much more about the dangerous effects of carbohydrates, especially refined carbohydrates, for heart disease. So that study was hugely flawed, but it was such an ambitious undertaking with so much data. It was so lauded in its day. And I think we can say it was like the Big Bang of nutrition studies. It has millions of citations, literally, like all of nutrition science still telescopes back to the 7-country study. Why is worth so much time in investigating it and understanding it in detail. And also, which shows like this is the weak, wobbly foundation upon which our saturated fat recommendations first were founded.
It is still astounding to think that this was able to happen, Nina. And I've heard you describe it as saying it was a combination of money, personal ambition, and bad science at the time. And it really forged, as you heard me saying earlier, because as we often say in Bermuda, when the US sneezes, Bermuda catches a cold. But the rest of the world followed these eventually American guidelines for diets throughout, and it entered into schools. It continues to be followed to this day. I guess I wonder, and so many people must have asked you, Nina, in your opinion, how was this allowed to happen? You kind of elaborated it on that they needed an answer, but it was sort of like poor science was made to suffice. I've heard you say before, correct?
Yes. So there was this panic, a vacuum of information, a need for some kind of explanation and a way, some kind of advice to give to the public. That was certainly one factor. There were financial incentives in place, as I document in my book. The Procter & Gamble, maker of Crisco oil, had been really a foundational donor of the American Heart Association going back to 1948 and had virtually launched the Heart Association. And then some years later, there's the head of the American Heart Association promoting Crisco oil in an advertisement. So, that's a link, and I know that the food industry was very active in nutrition science going back to 1940 when they established an interest group to do that. Those are the beginning of, Standard Biscuit Company, and they had interests and they promoted them through nutrition science in many different ways. But I think it's a fair question, like, where were the critics? How could this be allowed to happen? And again, sorry to keep going back to my book, but I document one critic after another, very senior level people who did oppose the diet heart hypothesis in Ancel Keys. So George Mann at the University of Vanderbilt, the guy, I'm just blanking on his name, at the Rockefeller University in New York, E.J. Ahrens. They were very prominent scientists who came out and spoke out against Ancel Keys again and again. Raymond Reiser at Texas A&M, highly respected scientist. And what they suffered was, I think it's fair to say, a level of bullying. So, Ancel Keys was astonishing in his attacks on anyone who ventured to criticize his idea or to propose an alternative idea. He would attack them in multi-page critiques in journals. He would accuse them of having financial backers. He used incredibly disparaging language that was both personally insulting and insulting of their science. He ruined careers. George Mann had said he was told me when I interviewed him in a nursing home late in life, he had opposed Ansel Keys, and he was a very senior scientist who had run part of the very well-known Framingham study, which did not find that saturated fat had any link to heart disease. That part of the Framingham study was never published, which speaks to the fact that the NIH was behind Ansel Keys as well. I'll hold on that for a second, but George Mann told me that when he was at NIH, at some point, a secretary pulled him out into the hall and said, if you continue to oppose Ansel Keys, you will see your research grant disappear. You will lose your research grant. And that indeed happened. And he later wrote a book in which he called Keys and his colleagues the Diet Heart Mafia. But the fact was that they did have the support of not only the American Heart Association, but from the very start, going back to the 1948, that, well, it wasn't called NIH then, but the National Institutes of Health was, intertwined with the American Heart Association, and in terms of its ideas and interests and policies and personnel, people going back and forth between them. So the major authorities in and outside of government were backing this hypothesis. And it became impossible as a researcher to maintain non-mainstream views. You couldn't get your articles published. You were disinvited from conferences. You lost your research grants. So that's what happened to critics. And this kind of bullying this set of intimidation or bullying tactics, as developed by Ansel Keys and his colleagues, is still being carried on today. So that is many of the scientists who are real acolytes of Keys persist with these same tactics. I'm just writing about, actually right now, Walter Willett, and who I think is one of the former head of the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, long-time opponent of saturated fat. He has a picture of himself shaking Ansel Keys' hand on the wall of his office. He was called out by Nature magazine for engaging in unprofessional behavior, where he called an opposing researcher's work a pile of rubbish. And he's done many other similar things, really degrading other people, anyone who opposes him. And that's exactly what Ansel Keys pioneered, and that's what keeps people in line, because it not only discredits the scientist, him or herself, but it also sends a potent warning sign to anyone else considering raising their head above the parapet, and lets them know this will not help your career in any way if you were to take this tack in your work.
It's, like I said before, still astounds me. And I'll quote you again, Nina, as I'm wont to do, because I just love the information that you put out. But I think in an interview that I heard you say that science cannot be self-correcting if alternative viewpoints are not accepted. And that's exactly what we're talking about. So we are starting to self-correct a little bit, but it's because of folks like you that come from an outside, a journalistic view, that are really looking into it. Because if you're intertwined, and we're going to get into how, and you talked a little bit about the seed oil companies got mixed in there, and big food got mixed in there, contributing funds to the American Heart Association back in the day. And it's absolutely incredible. It almost sounds like people were involved with the mob. And you've described it as that when you started peeling back these layers, you often felt like you were investigating the mob. I wonder if you could give some examples of things that maybe happened to you personally, where you've cited some other folks where you said that they got told that they would lose their grants, they would be shut down, they needed to pull this information. If it wasn't true, it'd be almost unbelievable to hear this stuff in regards to science, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it truly continues. It's truly remarkable. I mean, okay, when I first started researching in this area, it was true that I would call up research scientists at universities, and this is back, so early 2000s. Really, the low fat diet was still, unquestioned. And scientists would say, look, if you're going to question the low fat diet, I can't even talk to you, and would hang up on me. So you can see, like, the level of fear that pervades these environments. And there were scientists and early researchers in trans fats who were finding these weird problems with these. Trans fats are made when you hydrogenize oil. So any oil needs to be stabilized and made more solid in order to be used. You can't really use a greasy oil in most packaged food products. And so the process of hydrogenation solidifies it. But an awkward byproduct of the hydrogenation process are not only trans fats, which we came to know and got rid of, but dozens of other weird chemical isomers, it turns out. The early researchers of trans fats and other isomers, I spoke to 4 or 5 of them, and they told me about being harassed, about being, every paper that they would put out would be gone over with a fine-tooth comb, and errors would be identified even if they didn't exist. They said they became paranoid about their work because they were so attacked for everything that they did. Mary Enig, a very famous early researcher, she was literally called names and made fun of as a woman for the research that she did. More recently, Catherine Flegel, who's was a senior researcher at the CDC, she came out with findings that opposed something Walter Willett believed in about. She said, people who are overweight actually live a little longer than thin people, which was contrary to what most people think, and it was controversial, but. He came out, she's the one that Willett said her work was a pile of rubbish. And then he held a conference where just to attack her work, to which she wasn't invited, to defend herself. And they handed out pamphlets at other conferences where she was speaking. They would stand at the door and hand out pamphlets saying why she was wrong and what was wrong with her personally. And then more recently, Walter Willett went on the road with something called a disinformation triangle, where he accused no less than the co-founder of evidence-based medicine, Gordon Guyatt, who's in the Canadian Hall of Fame. He's so incredibly revered. Willett called Gordon Guyatt a disinformation scientist and tried to link him to big beef. I mean, I've been the subject of a whisper campaign for years saying that my work is funded by the meat industry. I have emails showing the famous New York professor who's trying to plant this rumor, and she's called up members of my board of this nonprofit that I run, trying to get them to resign, saying my work is funded by the meat industry. No documentation at all, no evidence of that, because it doesn't exist. When I wrote an article, that was actually the cover story of the BMJ magazine, a top medical journal. My article criticized the dietary guidelines. It showed in multiple ways how there was insufficient evidence to support our dietary guidelines, and that they were not using a rigorous process to review the science, among many other things in that article. It was subject to the biggest ever retraction request in recent history. Like 180 scientists signed that retraction request. Lucky, for me in the article, the editor-in-chief stood up for it strongly, wrote an editorial in my defense, but it was touch and go there. And if that's not an intimidation tactic, I really don't know what is. So, and it was terrible. Like, I actually say, like, I worried for the entire year that was under review. It caused me a lot of heartache. And that is the intention, is to make you miserable. And it's fair to say, like, it's not a rewarding career. Like, it's not like I'm invited to speak, give speeches at major conferences, or that, it's not a career that I think people would look at and say, oh, I want to do that too. It's not easy. And that is the intention of these tactics.
Nina, you definitely have to have had some thick skin by doing what you're doing. And again, we are so thankful that you have the intestinal fortitude to be able to do this, and the dogmatic approach to get to the truth. And I can just only imagine, and just those examples, I again thank you for doing that. And I just want to ask you a question before we talk about our friend Walter Willett, who I know you know well, because I want to get into the arrival of olive oil a little bit in the Mediterranean diet, which he is so
Yeah.
famous for advocating for and changing his own little food pyramid for. But these seed oils, just to touch on it one last quickly, I mean, they hadn't been in the food supply prior to the 1900s. All of a sudden, they're coming in, and their usage has increased 89% since then, and our metabolic health has clearly been impacted by the advent of these seed oils, much to the denial of the companies themselves. But at the same time, sugar has come in, and our consumption of sugar. Have you ever thought about, I'm sure you had, about which came first, the chicken or the egg, or is it the combination of both now that's causing so much ill health amongst us these days, let's say?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question, and I'm actually a little concerned at some of the crazy things that are said about seed oils these days. So I like, what we have is huge epidemics of metabolic diseases, such that 93% of all American adults today have a metabolic disease. That's insane. We're basically 100 of us percent of us are sick practically. What caused are these conditions? It is not easy to tease out. I've covered, I mean, as I said, like, I brought in the idea of seed oils and traced their history. They came into the food supply in the form of Crisco in 1911, and then they rocketed up in use and popularity. They're now, I would say, maybe 10% of all calories we consume. It's been the single greatest increase in any foodstuff over the course of the last 120 years, by far. So and to me, having reviewed the science, the clinical trial science, okay, gold standard science, shows cause and effect, that those clinical trials in which saturated fats were replaced by polyunsaturated vegetable oils, they consistently showed increased rates of death from cancer. Clinical trial results. They were taken seriously, so seriously that in the early 1980s, the National Institutes of Health hosted a series of very high-level conferences, meetings, to try to figure out what was going on with these cancer results. These are in trials on tens of thousands of people. So by one estimate, 76,000 people tested on this hypothesis. This is a huge quantity of data. And they could not figure out what was causing the increased cancer rates. Ultimately, they decided it was so important to restrict saturated fat that for heart disease, that benefit trumped any side effect of cancer. So to me, cancer is a pretty likely outcome. I think the evidence on heart disease is also fairly strong because there is good evidence showing that these oils, they oxidize. It means they pick up oxygen molecules. Oxidation, that's why people take antioxidants. Oxidation drives inflammation. Inflammation is a known cause of heart disease. And even though I would just add a note of doubt, in those clinical trials I just mentioned on heart disease, you didn't see great increases in bad heart disease outcomes in the groups eating the seed oils. So maybe, I mean, that's a counterfactual piece of information that I don't know what to do with. But but I would still put, cancer is probably a result of seed oils, heart disease likely, and then beyond that, does it fuel obesity? Maybe, evidence is weak. Diabetes? Maybe, evidence is weak. I mean, we just don't know. And those conditions, we know from clinical trials that if you reduce carbohydrates, total carbohydrates, even without restricting seed oils, you can reverse your type 2 diabetes, and you can lose a significant amount of weight. So that would argue against seed oils really affecting those conditions or being a major driver of those conditions. So I think we really don't know a lot of answers about seed oils. I would avoid them because there are far better options, and why risk it? And I think, choosing instead to cook with tallow, lard, suet, duck fat, ghee is a no-brainer. Um, and but I just like so, but I'm a little concerned like by all the claims that are now thrown out there about seed oils. And I think the evidence is stronger in terms of multiple randomized controlled clinical trials. The evidence is stronger for total carbohydrates. Total carbohydrates, not the kind slow versus fat. There's little evidence on that, but the main bulk of scientific literature supports reducing total carbohydrates to reverse uh, type 2 diabetes, obesity, heart disease, fatty liver, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, well, everything, mental health problems. I think that's where the evidence is strongest. The very strongest is sort of type 2 diabetes reversal.
Folks, I'm going to make sure that I link Nina and Gary Taubes' Substack in the show notes for today. So make sure you go sign up for their Substack and their emails, because Nina and Gary are still doing all this research and digging into these claims that are still being put out there today. And we'll talk a little bit at the end, and we're winding down, and as we wind down, about the American Diabetic Association's recent claim on carbohydrates that Nina's posting about on X. Make sure you follow her on X, otherwise known as Twitter, because it's a great follow and always interesting content. Nina, my next question as we move on is, it has to do with what you just talked about in a roundabout way, because you advocate, and I do certainly now, for more natural forms of cooking: tallow, suet, lard, butter. But as we know, Walter Willett and also Ansel Keys, to a degree, and his handshake and his photo in his office, all of a sudden olive oil came on the scene. And I want to let folks go get your book to really dig into it. The truth is, olive oil is not the health miracle that it's been purported to be because of the Mediterranean diet advocacy. And I wonder if you could just speak about how this Mediterranean diet came about at a very top level, and just talk to that a little bit, the olive oil side.
Yeah. Well, first I want to say truth is just what we think we know about science at any given moment. There is like we don't know the truth about anything really. We just like there's what we think we know based on the science, and we have to stay open to the idea that we could be wrong. But okay, so regarding olive oil and the Mediterranean diet, it's really worth reading the story because it's super fun and interesting. But it was born from Greek and Italian researchers who wanted to preserve their way of eating, and as they saw fast food just devastating their countries. And they met up with Walter Willett at Harvard, who uh, in the 80s, and who just fell in love with the Mediterranean, don't we all? Great food. So did Ansel Keys and his colleagues, back in the 1950s. And then it was super cheap too after World War II. They all decided they were going to try to characterize and quantify this Mediterranean diet. And they did this over a series of quasi-scientific, like not really scientific articles trying to say, oh, it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But of course, one of the points they make is like the Mediterranean diet is really varies across countries. It's not the same in southern Italy as even northern Italy, or as in southern Spain as in Greece. Those are different diets and with vastly different consumption of certain foods. And nevertheless, they try to quantify it, and then they package and promote it at Harvard with the Harvard imprimatur in 1993 with a conference in Cambridge, where Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Harvard is. They publish a special issue of the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition with a Mediterranean food pyramid in it, and everybody does articles. Well, it turns out this whole effort, which includes wonderful conferences all over the Mediterranean, food journalists are invited, beautiful food and events, and a little bit of science, a little bit of cooking demos. People who go to the conferences describe it like being in heaven, little hikes up the mountainsides of Crete. All of that is funded by the food industry, principally the European Olive Oil Council, which wants to expand the market for its products. So, and even that special issue of the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition was funded by the olive oil industry. And just as a little ironic note, the editor in chief of that issue was Mary Nessel of New York University, most famous for railing on people for their conflicts of interest in science, nutrition science. When I asked her about that issue, she's like, oh, well, we were just naive and I don't know. And, but at that point, she's like a woman in her late 40s or early 50s. Like she's hardly naive. Anyway, so this product becomes this huge, the diet itself becomes a huge commercial product. It's being written about by all these journalists who've been to these fantastic conferences. It's in books everywhere. There's Mediterranean everything. And then, well, I mean, we could talk about, there's hardly any science to show that this diet is really beneficial. The only slight benefit that has been seen from this diet is from trials that shows it may benefit your cardiovascular risk. I mean, there's no effect shown on obesity, diabetes, anything else. And even in the cardiovascular risk, it's mainly by lowering your risk of stroke. And that's from trials where people are eating 40% of their calories as fat. Well, the US version of the Mediterranean diet is nothing like that. It's, first of all, much lower in fat. And it, in the US, we're also no meat. Well, that's not true of the diet that was tested, the main trial that was tested in Spain. They didn't reduce meat at all, red meat at all in that trial. So our version of it is just so unlike the real thing. Also, because we're America and we're not major producers of olive oil, they remove the olive oil. If you go to the American Heart Association version of it or the one in the US Dietary Guidelines Mediterranean style diet, no olive oil. It's all been replaced by soybean oil. Yeah, I mean, you can see what a ridiculous concept it was from the start. It was a commercial concept. It was, I mean, it didn't reflect the actual Mediterranean diet that people eat. And then it was promoted because it's a great brand, and still is today. But the evidence really doesn't support it as a particularly healthy diet for the prevention of most metabolic diseases.
It's so interesting, this whole thing I just find riveting because of my own personal journey and following what I thought was correct based on the information that was out there, including the plant-based push, which I fell victim to, the vegan documentaries. I mean, I watched it all. I watched the Game Changers. I watched the Forks Over Knives. And being pescatarian/vegetarian at the time, I thought by eliminating all these animal foods completely, not only was I saving the planet, I was doing better for my health. And when you start to realize the ways in which you've been misinformed, it can get pretty eye-opening. And sometimes I must admit, I got a little angry because as I mentioned to you offline, I got very, very sick. I say that all to say is that it can be mind-numbing. And I just wanted to ask your opinion on whether Walter Willett and Ansel Keys share these same sort of traits that I mentioned earlier that we talked about, in that it's a combination still of personal ambition, money, and bad science. Do you still feel that's going on to this day today?
Oh yeah, that's definitely true. And I want to say I don't believe that Walter Willett is necessarily a bad person, although his bullying behavior is really is bad behavior. I think he really believes he's right. He has a dogmatic quality about his beliefs. He's unchanging. He's funded the funding at Harvard from all these plant-based interests, if not food companies, um, is so pervasive. I wrote about this in a Substack article. If anybody wants to read it, the whole long list of funders, and his whole history as a vegan activist, really. Yeah, so it's a conflation of financial interests, cognitive dissonance, how could I be wrong, the fame and accolades that come with being the guy who's invented the Mediterranean diet. And I mean, he rides nutrition, or he did from all his career. He rides things to fame and power. I mean, he was one of the main advisors on the diet for Eat Lancet, which is a near vegan, quasi vegan diet promoted by the World Economic Forum. I mean, launch parties in 40 cities around the world. And I mean, it's a great life, right? I mean, I'm sure he gets, $20,000 to say something for like 5 minutes at a dinner. I mean, it's a good life. And I think it all comes together for somebody like that. They're famous, they're loved, their ideas are revered, they're everywhere in the newspaper, they're invited to everything, they're well compensated, and they really truly believe, I think, that most likely that they're right.
Just looking now on the interpretations and modifications on diets that we see to this day, and I know you and, as I mentioned, a mutual friend of mine, Casey Ruff, had this discussion. You have now Dan Buettner talking about the blue zone diets, and I just had Dr. Bill Schindler on here who went to Sardinia, and he was just like he'd never eaten so much meat in his life in this blue zone, and the fact that they are claiming that these blue zones hardly ate any meat, and it's just not
That
actual
was never
fact.
true.
Yeah.
That's all been just lies. I mean, yeah, we don't have to get into that too much, but there's a lot of documentation about how not only is the food consumption was a bunch of lies, but so was the claims for longevity in those areas based on terrible data. That whole blue zone concept, you probably know, was purchased for 150 million by the Seventh Day Adventist Church. So now it may have always been intended for to be a church property, but it was, I think, from the start a very commercial concept that has done very well. And it perfectly dovetailed with all the biases that were rising at the time, and it's a very successful commercial idea. I mean, these ideas really resonate in people's minds, and there's so much propaganda around them. I mean, I think it's fair to say propaganda, and people just come to believe it's true. And so, our voices are much weaker, and we're not able to reach as many people, and we don't have the influence. It's not just media exposure, it's your ability to influence decision makers and reach, the blue zone people. They go in and they convince citizen groups, and they convince the leaders in city government, and then they get the whole city to adopt the blue zone plan. Yeah, I mean, the fact that this diet is now at the level of the World Economic Forum and is adopted at the by Norway, or the Nordic recommendations for those northern countries in Europe, and they're now the recommendations in Canada. What was it? Oh, in Germany, they have they have a 80% plant-based food wheel. So, I mean, the level of influence for these kinds of ideas is just so extraordinary.
Nina, it speaks to, and again, thank you for your time, and I'm conscious of it, so I'm going to start to wind down now over the next 10 minutes.
Great.
I just wanted to get your opinion on the state of play as we stand in 2024. And there's a few examples that we can look at where you've broken down the misinformation that's out there. Let me just talk about this for a second. There's been enormous change in the last decade, and I have to thank you again for your advocacy in this area. It really is the big fat surprise. For those folks that haven't got it, go get it and read it. It is, in my opinion, a seminal work that is going to be talked about generationally. So you should be so proud of your efforts in that regard, Nina.
Thank you.
Oh, you're more than welcome. And I fully believe that. What interests me is that the dietary guidelines are still the same. Even as you say, with 25 plus meta analysis on clinical trials, they still remain the same. However, interestingly, recently, they dropped the words low fat diet out of there, as
Right.
you talk about often. But yet now we have things like this twin study coming out, the continued plant-based agenda pushed. And as you heard, I fell victim to it because documentaries don't go through the peer review process. There's no peer review on documentaries, so you can literally say and almost do anything.
Right.
So a lot of folks are left in the wilderness trying to fend for themselves. And if longtime listeners of my podcast, and I'm on episode 59 with you here today, so it's not that long, but will know that I advocate for reading, learning, reading a book like The Big Fat Surprise, listening to podcasts with folks like yourselves who have done the deep dive, and then just either experimenting on yourself and trying, because what have you got to lose? Because if you're already in ill health and you want to feel better like I did, adding animal foods back in, where in your opinion do we stand today, Nina? What are you feeling like? Are we making progress here?
Um, well, I think my overall assessment has to be somewhat pessimistic, in that I think that what is happening in terms of official policy and the increasingly shameless tactics used to ignore, repress, and deny the science itself, as well as the people, the scientists, is becoming increasingly aggressive. So let me just give you an example. Unsaturated fats. When my book came out, it was like it triggered a new era, really, of scholarship on those fats, which is that scientists read my book, and I did a ton of publicity around it. They realized, oh my gosh, there are all these clinical trials on those 76,000 people I was talking about. All these clinical trials we've never really analyzed. We didn't even know they were there because they had previously been buried and suppressed. So, but I was able to unearth them. Scientists start looking at them. There are now more than 24 review papers. I mean, and the numbers, you could parse them in different ways, but there's more, nearly 20 systematic reviews, which is the rigorous kind of review, meta-analyses of the data, also very, very rigorous approach. 100% of those say saturated fat has no effect on cardiovascular or total mortality. This is data from clinical trials. None. Only 1 or 2 of those reviews says saturated fats has an effect on cardiovascular events like heart attacks. So most of them do not find any effect on cardiovascular events. I won't get into the weeds on that. But what's happened to all those review papers? Well, the US Dietary Guideline Committee has ignored them or paid attention to them, represented them in kind of this skewed way, misrepresented them, then ignored them. The American Heart Association ignored them. The World Health Organization ignored all but that one study that found an effect on cardiovascular events, ignored all the rest of them. So we're seeing a level of, the attempts to, the successful attempts to deny that the data exists, to suppress it. And that's happening because our leaders in science are just not, they're just not responsible, like responsible scientists. I don't know if there's another way to say it. Like the people who might speak out, I've co-authored papers with a number of these scientists, and they're people at the end of their careers. They have nothing to lose. Young scientists tell me, I'm too afraid to do this. I don't want to get kicked off this or that panel or whatever. And the scientists in control, they're heavily funded by the food and pharma industries. They don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to lose their grants. So there's like no referees in the room to, blow the whistle on this. So the ability to control our narratives, on our media, social platforms, is becoming increasingly heavy-handed. That's a whole other conversation, but I think it's harder and harder to get the truth out. So that's what makes me pretty pessimistic. I also see the flood of disinformation out there on plant-based diets all the time. It doesn't matter if it's backed by a study. We just saw last week, the American Heart Association puts out a press release on how intermittent fasting will, increase your chances of heart disease by 91% based on a press release. It's terrible data. The people who are supposedly having this increase in cardiovascular events, Zoe Harcombe showed there was only 31 people that whole assertion was based on. And that's not the first time that the American College of Cardiology or the American Heart Association puts out a press release based on zero or insignificant data, but they're just flooding the zone with misinformation. Keto is bad for you. Keto will kill you. Intermittent fasting is bad for you. And it's impossible to conclude anything other than these organizations have no interest in your health. They don't benefit if you reverse your way out of disease, and they have so much influence. They can flood all of our information airwaves. So that's what makes me pessimistic. The optimistic part of the story is people are learning that through social media, through shows like yours. I mean, there's a lot of pressure to try to censor, even if this like it's on YouTube, there's pressure, and I see it on YouTube happening too. It's spreading like wildfire. I mean, you see the number of people going carnivore is astonishing. Who would have thought, like just a few years ago? So I think that people getting healthy is probably the most powerful tool that we have. And then we have some philanthropists now who've entered this space who are funding a lot of research. I have particular hope in the area of mental health that there will be real progress there. So that's kind of a long answer, more than you wanted.
No, I love long answers because every single point is so salient that you give, Nina, and specifically as you mentioned in the terms in the area of mental health. And I'm hoping to get Dr. Georgia Eid on specifically in that regard coming up on the podcast. I've reached out to her,
Yeah.
but the folks that I've interviewed, Valerie Smith, who you probably have followed maybe on Twitter, was an
Yeah,
amazing one. Brett Lloyd, the thankful carnivore, Robin Dobbins, who healed her bipolar. These are major things that are being overcome through just dietary changes and
true.
should be really investigated. But they're not even for the 2030 guidelines, they're not even going to look at low carbohydrate diets. They're not even they're not even going to examine them, which is so sad.
That's been true for the last two rounds of the guidelines as well. They just ignore it. I have a bunch of emails that I obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests showing that they're aware that they're burying the data on low carbohydrate diets, but they're doing it anyway.
Nino, the island that I live in Bermuda, the listeners know that, and I was born and raised here. We have one of the highest incidences per capita of diabetes anywhere. And it is a shame that there's just no traction. I'm shouting here from the rooftops about low carbohydrate. And many of those cases are type 2, which can be altered
Reverse.
through diet.
Mhm.
And it's so sad. But I just wanted to share that with the audience. Nina Teicholz,
Diet.
I am so grateful for you today. I am so grateful for your time. It has been such an honor for me. I've been looking forward to chatting with you, as you know, for many, many months, and I'm glad your schedule and my schedule finally aligned to do this. I hope I can have you back on at some point, maybe next season when I start sometime this year later, because I have so many things. I took about 5 pages of notes to talk to you about, but I wanted to just cover the top level first, and then we can start to dig down on some things. Folks, make sure you go check Nina out on her Substack, on X, on Instagram, and also her website, Buy the Big Fat Surprise. Where else, Nina, can folks look for you?
That's it. I mean, I assume you're going to put those in the show notes. Yeah, great. No, that's all great. Thank you. Especially the newsletter that I'm now doing with Gary Taubes called Unsettled Science on Substack. That's really where you can also support my work, which would be great.
Nina, I meant absolutely everything I said. I thank you so much for your advocacy, your work, the Big Fat Surprise, and the work you continue to do and put out there in the hopes that we can affect some real change, which you have already done. It's just been amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your
Thank
day.
you. Thanks, James, for having me on. It's good to talk to you.
And that's a wrap on this episode of Carnivorist Chats. If you've made it this far, I want to say thank you for listening, and also thank you in advance for liking, subscribing, or sharing this episode. Thanks again to Equip Foods, Carnivore Snacks, and the Carnivore Bar. Don't forget to check the link in the show notes to get a discount on their products. Until the next time, be well,